Hey, Sound Politics listeners, Scott here. And in what is becoming a little bit of a ritual for our recording days at Sound Politics, something happened after we taped. So we're going to talk some toward the end of this episode about Seattle Children's, which paused surgeries for trans minors because the hospital is afraid of losing federal funding. After we taped, a federal judge in Maryland ordered the Trump administration to keep federal funding in place for hospitals that offer gender transition treatments for people under the age of 19. So we're going to talk about those issues and several others today on the show. I just want you to keep in mind there's an update. I think I anticipated it. I say that on the show. So here is the conversation we had today with Austin Jenkins and Viv McCall. Libby's out this week, of course. Austin, when my producer reached out to Viv about coming on the show, she was hyped you were going to be on with all of us. In fact, she called you the Stephen King of journalists. And I want to know, is this a title you accept? Viv, what does that even mean?
Stephen King writes a lot and writes really fast. And Austin writes a lot and writes really fast. It's really impressive.
Yeah, but my plot lines cannot compete.
Yeah, when's your Dark Tower coming out? What would that be?
Exactly. I do try to be productive. There's a lot of news to cover.
Here's this is going to be an incredible turn. Speaking of a lot of news to cover, it's time for Sound Politics. And then our theme runs
Would you sing it for us, just to get the vibe?
Yeah. Bum, 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 bum. It's time for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone, and today we're talking about privacy. What do you have a right to? Your data, your gender presentation, your child's health information, your own health information, your brain? They're all questions here in Washington and nationwide. So we're digging into it with two incredible guests this week. Austin Jenkins, staff writer at Pluribus News, and Vivian McCall, staff writer for The Stranger, covering queer culture and politics in Seattle and beyond. Thank you both for joining me.
Great to be here, Scott.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
We're going to get into a few different stories about how local and national conversations are challenging our ideas about privacy and personal autonomy. Austin, I want to start with you, one of the many stories you've recently written. There's so many. We're not even going to get time to talk about all of them. I referenced one about your right to your brain's data in the intro that we're not going to talk about even. We don't even have time for it. But I wanted to reference it because I wanted to say your brain.
You should be thinking about your brain privacy.
I think we should all be thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about it until I read your story, but yeah. I do. Let's talk about some other data laws making their way through our legislature that look to regulate data access. These bills have something to do with AI. There's a comprehensive privacy bill. Tell us what you've been writing about.
Well, I think this requires a little bit of national context, which is that
love it.
Several years ago, there was a bill called the Washington Privacy Act that emanated from the Washington State Senate. It passed, but could never get through the State House. And interestingly, the Washington Privacy Act became the inspiration for, or the template for, a bunch of other states when they went to pass their own data privacy laws. And by the way, what we're talking about here is the idea that anytime we're on the internet, somebody is out there hoovering up our tracks, right, and our information and learning a lot about us. This whole idea that, Google knows more about me than my wife does. Right? So states have been trying to figure out, well, how do we give consumers some more rights around this? Because most people don't even really know how this works. It's a black box. But interestingly, the Washington bill became a template for a bunch of other states. Flash forward to now, 19 states have comprehensive data privacy laws on the books. Washington State, ironically, is not one of them. We do, a caveat here, we do have something called the My Health, My Data law, which passed a couple of years ago after Roe v. Wade was overturned, which is very focused and exclusively focused on health data. But this year, State Representative Shelley Kloba is trying again. She's got something called the People's Privacy Act. I would describe it as a fairly pro-consumer measure. The question I have is just, will this be the year? Because what seems to be happening, the dynamic that's so interesting in Washington seems to be almost like a gun shyness about regulating tech. And I think it's two things. One, we are a tech state. There's an interest in listening to the tech industry when they try to regulate in this space. But the minute legislators who are willing to talk to tech and let them influence the details of the bill, that the minute that happens, then you've got a bunch of Democrats who are very pro-consumer, who are mistrustful or distrustful of tech, and then they don't want to pass the bill. And
Yeah.
so I think that dynamic is maybe a little bit unique to Washington, but it seems to be preventing progress around this particular topic.
I'm kind of curious. We're obviously flush with, Democrat tech money, like Bill Gates's, Reid Hoffman's, the founder of LinkedIn. I assume maybe a lot of Democratic legislators don't want to scare those tech dollars away from our state. Is this a case of, like not wanting to bite the hand that feeds you if you're a Democrat?
Yes, there are different types of Democrats and sort of different orientations, if you will. So I don't, maybe it's about campaign finance or about, who's funding your campaigns. I think maybe sort of more philosophically, it's like, if you're going to be regulating an industry, should the people who are being regulated have a pretty significant say in crafting how those regulations work, with the idea being that they know their business better than the legislators, and you want the legislation to be effective and to sort of be implementable, maybe is more the right word. And that's sort of one school of thought. And I think we saw that in the Washington Senate several years ago with the Washington Privacy Act. We'll work with industry on this. What we've seen more in the Washington State House is a view that if tech's got its fingers in the details of the bill, that's a red flag. And this is what's interesting about this current bill that's being proposed, whether there should be a private right of action, which is the ability for the consumer to actually file a lawsuit to enforce the law and not just leave that in the hands of the attorney general. And there's a school of thought that says, essentially, if you don't have a private right of action, you have a pretty much unenforceable law, because the attorney general will never have the resources to enforce adequately. And on the other side, the business side, it's just open season for a ton of lawsuits that are going to annoy us and also cost us a lot of money. And so, frankly, it becomes a sticking point with a lot of these privacy bills around the country. Most of them don't have a private right of action at this point. In fact, I'm not sure any of them. And in this state, there are legislators who won't vote for a privacy law that doesn't have that.
Yeah. Viv, we've talked a lot in the past, just in life, about being on the internet. We're both on the internet a lot for work, for fun.
Yes.
It can be, I think sometimes it feels like when I read about data privacy, I feel like my data is just this like big party, and everyone has already invited themselves, and it's hard for me to kind of feel like we can put, like Meta is here now. Elon Musk seems to have worked his way in, or maybe working his way in through the government. The government was always here hanging out in the background. Like, how do you think about it as a consumer and as a journalist? Just like, can states actually roll that back and like disinvite people, get people out of the party?
I think we have to. I think it's actually essential to our basic freedoms in this country that we do roll back what tech is able to do. Because right now, tech and social media essentially has a monopoly over how our lives function. It has disrupted basically every industry that exists. They have algorithms that work in ways that we are not party to. If we don't have things like a private right of action, and companies are so concerned that a private right of action would essentially make their business model untenable, is there something about that business model that is fundamentally opposed to basic human liberty and dignity? I think it possibly is. I'm trying to be less on the internet because I have noticed the ways in which it nudges me to think things that are untrue, or the ways that it monopolizes my time and it monopolizes my critical thinking and it monopolizes really my enjoyment of life. I think that sounds very dark and serious, but I actually think it is a fairly dark and serious question at this time, especially when tech, in the past, there has been this presumption that tech will basically align with Democrats. Tech aligns with power.
Hmm.
And tech is also an industry that has no fundamental internal ethics. And not to say that there aren't individuals within tech that act ethically. It's just that there is no real code of ethics that we know of or that we can rely on to ensure that these companies are acting in good faith. If they're touching the legislation that we want to possibly rein them in, I think it's possible that legislation could be a lot less effective because these companies have proven sort of Houdinis of getting themselves out of loops and ropes that are supposed to constrain them. Um, we're at a moment that tech oligarchs are siding with a federal government that is testing the limits of federal power, that is testing the separation of powers. So I think that it's actually of fundamental importance that we here in Washington State do everything that we possibly can to guarantee our own privacy and to guarantee our own sovereignty from these companies.
Austin, you mentioned the My Health, My Data Act, and I want to talk about this really big story that I totally missed from just a couple days, sometime earlier this week. It involves Amazon. Can you tell us about the way Amazon, according to these lawsuits, has allegedly been tracking people and allegedly breaking Washington state's law?
Well, My Health, My Data has a private right of action. So that's significant.
And
And
that's the
that is
abortion one specifically. It's mostly related to reproductive rights.
right. And it was, again, passed after Roe v. Wade was overturned. So now what's happened is the first test of that law in the form of a class action lawsuit filed against Amazon. Bloomberg reported on this and basically said that the allegation in the lawsuit is that Amazon violated the My Health, My Data Act by tracking users' location data without their consent and used it for targeting advertising and other purposes. Amazon denies this, says the claims are not accurate. The spokesperson told Bloomberg they look forward to explaining this in court. But this is the first real test of this law that's a couple of years old now. And where health data, consumer health data becomes really sensitive is that if you go to the doctor's office and have a conversation with your doctor, that's protected by federal health privacy law. But if you have your phone on you and go shopping at Target and pick up, a pregnancy test or other consumer products that might hint or leave little, a trail of the kind of medical issues you're dealing with, that could potentially be used to then market to you. It could also, and what the legislators here were concerned about is if you're within, say, 100 or 1,000 feet of an abortion clinic, perhaps you are seeking reproductive services. And how could that be used? Could the long arm of the law from Texas, for instance, reach into Washington and try to prosecute somebody from Texas who came here for an abortion? I mean, that was the kind of thing that the state legislators were thinking about. What are the areas of your health data that are not currently protected by existing health privacy laws? And how to protect people in Washington state, particularly, as you mentioned, reproductive rights, from laws in other states that intend to crack down or to restrict those rights.
So sometimes a lot of this stuff can feel hypothetical, like, oh, what but the thing I always struggle with privacy is like, for me, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know. What are you going to figure out if you're tracking me and what grocery store I go to or whatever. But these private medical decisions obviously can become very public ones if you're being tracked, like we've talked about, if the nature of your decision becomes the focus of other states with laws against abortion, or, right now with the federal government, which has focused a lot on transgender health care and, just where public funding is supporting that. So I wanted to bring this all home before we go, and I want to make it sort of personal for listeners and local, right? Because it is. Viv, you reported on how President Trump's orders hit home at Seattle Children's Hospital. Tell us about that.
All right, so the patient 16 gets a call from the hospital that basically his surgery scheduled for the next day was going to be postponed indefinitely over one of Donald Trump's orders over one of Donald Trump's executive orders that bans federal funding for gender affirming care
Mm,
of all kinds for anybody under the age of 19. That extends to hospitals. And as you know, Seattle Children's is a major research institution, not just locally,
yeah.
but in the country. So the threat of losing federal funds is real. They have a ton of research staff. They depend on money from Health and Human Services. They depend on grants from the NIH. I believe they're in one of the top four uh, hospitals or children's hospitals in the country that gets funding from the NIH. So the threat was real. Whether or not they had to comply with that order is another question entirely. As we know, executive orders are not laws. That isn't how our system
Right.
works. Health and Human Services would have to issue some kind of rule, and then that rule would have to go through a public comment period. Um, it would take a long time for that order to go into effect. However, that's presuming that we're, working under normal conditions. I think anybody that is opening their eyes and ears to what's going on right now is very aware that we're not working under normal conditions
Mm,
and that this administration is not necessarily concerned with legal processes. So I think the hospital was very nervous about losing money. The family actually went to the hospital the next day because they felt like they didn't really have enough answers. The mom was not really able to get those from the hospital, so they show up for their call time for the surgery the next morning. And they talk to staff there who basically reiterate the same point that if we lose this money, a lot of other kids could suffer. So we're just going to have to postpone this surgery until we know more. A lot of people are very upset about this for quite a few reasons, because the language in the order is making all of these claims about gender affirming care that are just fundamentally untrue. It's comparing it directly to chemical castration, for example. It's comparing it to mutilation and female genital mutilation. Um, this is not how this care works. And certainly the people who have written these orders are aware of that. But it spreads a certain kind of political message. And I think a lot of people here are, on a fundamental level, upset that, hey, my kid's care is being disrupted and I'm not getting proper notice of that. And they're also upset. The hospital, which is supposed to be providing this evidence-based medical care that they have, gone to for a while, is not, presumably complying in advance with these orders that are not necessarily legal, not necessarily enforceable. That is kind of the situation that we're in now. Last week, AG Nick Brown filed a lawsuit that could possibly block this order from going into effect. There's going to be a hearing tomorrow, so we'll know more then.
yeah, I was going to say by the time you hear this, there may be a decision, and another order, may be frozen. Austin, you follow state legislatures nationwide. Do you have a sense of how lawmakers in other parts of the country are responding to orders like this when it comes to trans health care and rights and funding, federal funding for hospitals and things like that?
Scott, before I answer kind of what we're seeing in that sense, let me just say that there are a lot of red states still passing laws this year that restrict transgender rights or restrict access to facilities based on a person's gender as assigned at birth. So that trend continues in red states, and that was happening even before the Trump order. Just kind of anecdotally, what I'm seeing is that you've got the New York Attorney General warning hospitals that if they comply with the White House's executive order, that could put them at odds with New York State's
Wow.
laws. So there's that tension, which I think is also setting up here in Washington State.
It
And then
is.
just interestingly, the Democratic governor of very red Kansas, Laura Kelly, just the other day vetoed a bill that would have banned gender transition services for youth under 18. This is the second time she's vetoed such a
Yeah.
bill. This time around, the Republican legislature thinks it has the votes to override that veto.
And, I just want to add on to that. 26 states have now banned or restricted gender affirming care for people under the age of 18 in some way. And I think what we're seeing here is this order is sometimes misinterpreted as, oh, Trump has banned gender affirming care for people under the age of 19. He hasn't banned gender affirming care. He's restricted federal funds from going to support gender affirming care, which is essentially twisting the arm of blue states. And it's really a continuation of this general Trumpian policy, which is we don't have to legislate, we don't have to govern. We can essentially play a game where we are compelling states to act because the threat of losing funds would be so great that certainly they're going to comply with these orders. And it is setting up a clash on two levels. Nick Brown's lawsuit is a constitutional argument based somewhat on the separation of powers, based on the Fifth Amendment, or equal protection under the Fifth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment, which should guarantee Washington the right to legislate its own health care. And then when you look at New York and A.G. James, that's a situation where state law is going to clash directly with this EO, state anti-discrimination laws. Here in Washington, transgender people are protected right in the text of the Washington Law Against Discrimination. There is another law that guarantees that insurers will cover all forms of gender-affirming care. The protections are quite strong here, so we could see another challenge on that basis in sometime in the future. And again, this is only one of 4 orders that have gone toward restricting the civil rights of transgender people in some way.
You know, that point that you're bringing up, Viv, is also that the battle here is in bank accounts this time. And some folks were prepared for that or preparing for it, like the Washington State Treasurer. But in some ways, it's kind of impossible to prepare because if you can't get the funds in your account, and you can't, you know, the threat of that is, you know, it hangs over your entire research institution, your entire government.
Right. Seattle Children's filed a declaration in Nick Brown's lawsuit, kind of outlining what would be the financial cost if they lost federal funds. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. It's kind of an unimaginable sum of money, but you're talking about a large research institution. And I think that you can really extend that to states. It And yes, this is being battled out in the courts, but that's also presuming this administration respects the authority of the courts. Elon Musk and JD Vance have openly questioned the authority of the courts. So what happens when a court or the Supreme Court says, no, Donald, this is unconstitutional? We actually don't know. That's, I think, an actual real concern that we have to have maybe for the first time in living memory.
An exciting thought to end on.
That's one way to put it, maybe.
Vivian McCall, you're a staff writer for The Stranger, covering queer culture and politics in Seattle and beyond. Austin Jenkins, you're a staff writer at Pluribus News. You've both been incredible guests. Thank you both for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
That's it for Sound Politics today. I'm Scott Greenstone. Our producer this week is Sarah Leibovitz. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. And if you love listening to us as much as we love listening to ourselves, this is a call out. This is a call out to me specifically that someone wrote in the script. But if you do, consider a donation. There's a link in the show notes at kuow.org/politics. Leave a passive-aggressive note in there just to stay with the spirit of things, and we'll be back next week.